will you please welcome President Clinton, the 42nd President of the United States and the chair of the Bill, Hillary, and Chelsea Foundation. I'm going to get a kiss.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lynn, Evelyn, Lord Mayor. You know, if you grew up in Arkansas right after World War II, even if you got to be President of the United States, it's still a real rush to be in Guildhall. I was promised on this 800th anniversary that at the end of the ceremony I could go down and sneak a look at the Magna Carta. You might remember a few interesting developments since old King John put his name down to a document he must have dearly despised. And it should remind us all that there are no final victories or defeats in politics. You just have to keep at it. I want to thank Lynn and all the sponsors and the participants for giving us a second shot to discuss inclusive capitalism. Last year, I tried to make the case that inclusive capitalism was the best way to produce shared prosperity and to save the whole idea of social capital. And capitalism is the best way to amass wealth, create and operate markets, and give new ideas an opportunity to have their sway. But we had first to do something to moderate its inequalities, its instabilities, its unintended consequences, which are manifest differently, I might add, in developed and developing countries. If a lot of our discussion today was about developed economies, and we know there has been a decades-long and growing disconnect in most of them, including the newly wealthy ones, between increased productivity and increased wages for the people working at the firm who made the productivity possible. This is now a trend because it's been going on, the gap's been widening for some time, but we grew very strong during a period when the people who worked in a firm's incomes went up in tandem with the productivity increases they helped to provide. We know that in the aftermath of the financial crash, which we're still not quite over yet, although most societies have replaced the jobs they lost and quicker than the historic average for job replacement after a financial crash. That in the United States, for example, 95% of the income gains went to people in the top 5% of the income bracket, and that aggravated an already established tendency for people with money to be interested more in trading it in a narrow sphere, often with new and creative financial instruments, rather than investing it down and out into creating new enterprises and more employment. In developing countries, it is manifest the absence of inclusive capital by uneven investment, aggravated by corruption in many nations, and by a lack of capacity in others, in both the government and the private sector. I have just been through, as many of you probably have, an agonizing example of that in the Ebola epidemic in Liberia, Sierra Leone, where a lot of British doctors and medical personnel did heroic work, in Guinea. 4 of the staff members of the Clinton Health Access Initiative never left Liberia, not for a single day. And thank God they were not infected. But if that country had had a good health system, the death toll would have been 50, not 5,000. In Nigeria, there was a case of Ebola. A case. It happened in the Lagos area where the system is best organized, and public health workers visited 19,000 homes in 4 days. Isolated the people who'd come in contact with the person who was infected. Nobody else was infected. It was over. So one case for inclusive capitalism is the creation of systems which work in healthcare, education, infrastructure, building a modern economy. In some materials that were sent to me, Lynn had defined the term. A lot of people hear it and they say, that sounds good, what does it mean? Is somebody going to come seize my bank account and hand it out? So this is the definition that was provided at the conference, with minor amendments by me only for clarification purposes. First, inclusive capitalism means moving from a shareholder to a stakeholder business economy, including alongside shareholders, employees, suppliers, customers, and communities in which companies are a part. Second, it means moving the corporate culture from a focus on short-term growth driven by keeping the stock prices high and reimbursing the top management accordingly to a longer-term perspective. One of our meetings at this conference proved that countries with a longer-term perspective and a stakeholder mentality actually were more profitable over the longer term than companies focused on quarterly earnings. And third, it means investing in the empowerment of employees, their families, and the communities. Lynn wrote a piece in the Huffington Post called Us and Them, saying we've got to get rid of the us and them economy and create a bigger us economy and a smaller them economy. I think that's our best hope to win what I believe will be the defining battle of the first half of the 21st century. The battle between the positive and negative forces of our interdependence. This era of global interdependence is pretty good for most of us. Otherwise, you wouldn't be in these chairs today. It's a fascinating time to be alive. There are all these unbelievable opportunities. You can go places, learn things, do things, see the power of technology lifting lives. It's stunning. But it is also full of new and painful vulnerabilities. Today, we got the whole load. Forced me to change my talk. 27 people at a beachfront hotel in Tunisia, murdered by terrorism. Why? An extreme example of resentment. It's a place where the Arab Spring is working, because even though there had been an authoritarian government, there was enough of the makings of a private economy and a civil society that they refused to allow the country to collapse so that extremists could use it as a playground for looting and violence. Can't have that. We'll just kill a few people and try to kill off their tourism. Then an explosion at a Shiite mosque in Kuwait, a country with relatively new leadership, a majority Sunni country that was striving for religious reconciliation within Islam. And then France was hit again after Charlie Hebdo, a beheading and 2 injuries at a gas factory in southeastern France, the genesis of which we don't really know. Almost a decade ago, the great economist and social commentator Amartya Sen wrote a book called Identity and Violence, in which he chronicled the long history of people seeking meaning in their lives by what I would call negative reference identity. That is, I am a Sunni, you are a Shia, you are less than me, less human than me. Across race and gender and religion and ethnicity. And as soon as the Cold War was over, then the Berlin Wall came down, we got treated to a dose of it here in the heart of Europe, which I'm thinking about now because in just a little over a week, I'm going back to Srebrenica in Bosnia, where the slaughter actually finally galvanized enough support for the United States and Europe to end the long Bosnian War with just 4 days of NATO bombing and then the peace conference in Dayton. But it cost 250,000 lives and 2 million refugees. People that were biologically indistinct based on the crude tools we had in the 1990s, but by accidents of history were Croatian Christians, Serbian Orthodox Christians, or Bosnian Muslims fought because they thought their differences were all that mattered. For 500 years they got along, and then one day the ugly differences rose up. What's all that got to do with inclusive capitalism? You cannot hold an interdependent world together without inclusive politics, inclusive social policies, and inclusive economics. You cannot have a society where people wake up every day full of resentment and anger and bitterness and a sense of disempowerment and a sense of victimhood. Even if it is justified based on the objective facts of how they live, it is a totally counterproductive way to confront each new day. It will never work. And therefore, those of us who are doing well, if we take too much, will pay a big price. A few years ago, I became friends with a man in his 80s who was a member of the other political party in America, and we were on the board of the Constitution Center in Philadelphia. You know, it's sort of our version of the Magna Carta. His name was John Bogle. He founded Vanguard and the whole concept of investing in an indexed mutual fund. It enabled Americans of normal means to save for their retirement by investing in a fund that was representative of the stock market as a whole and therefore representative of the economy as a whole. He said, you'll have to leave it here a while if you want enough to retire on, but if you believe in the American economy's future, your investment will grow as the economy grows. And I don't believe, he said, that anybody over the long run can make more money out of the stock market than the economy makes. It's been a godsend to many people. So Bogle, a Republican for life, wrote a book a few years ago called Enough. And I thought enough of it to agree to write the introduction to the second printing of the book, because I thought that we should reach across all the partisan divides in America to say, if you believe in capitalism, it has to be inclusive. It has to be focused on human welfare, both for the people who work in companies and the people who are affected by their activities. So what does us and them mean? It means if you don't want identity to lead to violence, you got to have more people in the us category and fewer in the them category. For the British citizens here, I want you to know the very first thing I thought about when I saw that horrible story about the bombing in Tunisia. Yesterday, I was invited by a friend of mine to go to one of the lowest income constituencies in the entire UK, a good ways from here, but still in London, to a school where City Year volunteers are working. That's a group founded in America by two graduates from Harvard in about 1989. I found them in 1991. They became the model for my national service legislation. They're still our largest affiliate. And I took it to South Africa. And then they started going to other countries. So there were about 50 of these City Year volunteers. And they work with the students. They're a highly diverse group, and more than half of the families live in public housing. And I looked out there at these beaming kids. They're young people, and they work for a very modest amount of money. They're just proud. They just want these kids in this difficult neighborhood from all different ethnic and religious backgrounds to have a better life. And in the crowd of the volunteers, the City Year kids, more than 10% of them, I don't remember whether it was 6 or 8 or 9 of about 50, were Muslim girls with their scarves on their head, happy and proud to be working with other young people without regard to their religion, without regard to their politics, to put the children they were trying to help first because they thought they could build a common future even in a difficult part of London. That's really what this inclusive capitalism is all about. Not a guarantee of prosperity for everybody, but a guarantee of a fair chance and of being part of a future. And never becoming a victim, never having to accept the fact that every tomorrow is going to be like yesterday. That's the case for raising people's pay who are at the bottom of the pyramid, whether they're in very poor countries or in very rich ones. One of our participants, Adam Pothen, from the Peterson Institute, showed how raising the wages of people at the bottom in the United States could actually help the overall economy, and not surprisingly, because if you give people enough to live on, they can become consumers again. It sounds interesting, but believe it or not, there are still people, every time we raise the minimum wage in America, who say, oh, the sky is falling, this will finally break the back of free marketeers everywhere. No, it won't. It will create shared prosperity and inclusive capitalism. One of our most impressive speakers today was the chairman of Pepsi-Cola, Indra Nooyi, an Indian American, who said that she wanted her company and companies in America across the board to start doing business in a different way, to start earning money in a different way, to be able to look at their long-term prospects and to do it in terms of what was right for the society. What's right for the environment? How are we going to protect our kids from the worst consequences of climate change? What's right for public health? And not its short-term profits. And I got to thinking that that's basically what I do for a living now with our foundation. I just go around trying to take money away from people who got it and give it to people who don't. You know, I guess I'm a lot more like Robin Hood than King John. But I try to do it in a way that promotes empowerment, not just income transfers. And I try to convince businesses to make money in a different way. That's why almost 2/3 of all the people on AIDS drugs around the world get the medicine from contracts we negotiated at the lowest prices. Every one of our suppliers is making more money than they were before they lowered the price of AIDS drugs. Every single one of them. Why? Because we dramatically increased the volume and improved the supply process. That's why we were able to convince PepsiCo and the other major providers of soft drinks and big juices to reduce the calories in drinks shipped to American schools by 90%. 90%. And every one of them still making money with flavored water and smaller portions and other options. They decided they could make money in a different way. That's inclusive capitalism too, because it's reducing childhood obesity, which will reduce type 2 diabetes, which will reduce health care and leave more people drinking Pepsi-Colas when they're in their 30s instead of sitting in wheelchairs. Making money in a different way. You can't do that if you have to turn an increase every quarter. But if you went to talk to any of our providers of medicine, or any of the people providing these soft drinks, or any of the people who sell fertilizer and seeds to our big farming operations for small farmers in Africa, they would all tell you they're proud that they're making money in a different way, and that leads to inclusive capitalism. The ultimate example of inclusive capitalism for me in developing countries are the farmers, mostly women, we help in Malawi and Tanzania, and we're going other places now, farming an acre of land, who almost triple their production and do it at lower costs with higher quality seeds and fertilizer they can get, because we buy it all in volume for large numbers. And then we take the stuff to market. Inclusive capitalism. Their incomes go up or down like all farmers. If the weather's bad, they don't grow as many crops. If the crops are too numerous, the price drops. They don't drop out of capitalism, but they drop in at a much higher base, and their kids can go to school for a change instead of working when they're 8 or 9 years old. And we have a chance to build a future. They are highly unlikely to commit acts of terror. In the United States, we've had 2 developments in the last year or so that I think show you the battle lines of the attempt to develop an inclusive capitalism, which requires, as I said, inclusive politics. In Tennessee, which is next door to my native state of Arkansas, there is a very compelling Volkswagen plant. I was very jealous when they got it, and I was a young governor. The Germans moved their plant to Tennessee. And the workers are represented by the United Auto Workers. And the UAW and the Volkswagen managers reached the kind of agreement that is normal for them in Germany, but unheard of in America, where they would basically share the upside and the downside of changing production techniques that they thought would make a big difference. The union took a risk, but so did the managers entrusting an American union to do what they were used to a German union and other European unions doing, but not American. So the workers have to vote on this pact, which is going to raise the living daylights out of their pay, which is much lower than it is for auto workers in Germany. It's a big pay raise. The entire political establishment of the state went on a personal campaign to personally pressure every employee in that plant to vote against it. Because they said our brand is being non-union, meaning anti-union, and God forbid if this works. You'd think if they had enough conviction, about their philosophy, they would be sure it would fail and they would want this experiment to proceed. But in fact, they were afraid that inclusive capitalism would work. And they actually, in this small community, were able to scare enough of the workers that they turned down a big increase in pay and the prospect of owning a big chunk of the future. By contrast, the largest energy retrofit program in America is being funded by public and private union pension funds, based on a wacky idea I had 3 or 4 years ago that I sold the building trades and AFL-CIO and the American Federation of Teachers. They promised to spend $10 billion to build infrastructure projects and improve energy efficiency in buildings. After the first $5.6 billion was spent, they had created 50,000 jobs and trained almost 1 million workers in a variety of skills. Now they just allocated another $6 billion. They promised to spend $14 billion, not 10. For those of you who fly into it, we're going to modernize LaGuardia Airport, which hasn't been modernized in decades. 15,000 more jobs. We're going to get 140 to 160,000 jobs out of their commitment. And guess what? It helps them. More jobs for their members, more money into the pension fund, good return on the investment. Inclusive capitalism. We just heard a fascinating talk from my friend Carlos Slim, who's here. And the first time we ever met, all we did was talk about sports. The second time we met, he said, I don't like charity, just giving money to people except after an emergency. We should empower people. And as I told a few people over there, I believe Carlos Slim has provided a college education for more people than anyone who ever lived. Somewhere around 300,000, maybe more now, in Mexico. But he called me one day when a Canadian friend of mine, Frank Zuster, said he was going to spend $100 million in the Americas, and we were going to do it together to create an inclusive capitalism in poor areas, in Peru and Colombia, now in El Salvador and poor areas of Mexico. He said, nobody's ever done that before from the north, for us in the south. I want to be a part of it. So we have my favorite program we do, trains Incan Indian women, the ancient tribe, who have never had an income in their lives, to basically sell consumer products in remote villages. And these women get these products on consignment. We've been doing this for 3 years now. We have not lost one tube of toothpaste. Not one. And all these people are getting a regular check. So now we're doing it in Haiti. In Colombia, we're helping farmers and fishermen to produce and sell their products and to process the food. We built a food processor and freezer for them, and as soon as the cost of the project is recovered, we're going to give it to them. All we're doing is organizing markets to make capitalism inclusive. And we have never asked anybody who does business with us to lose money, only to make money in a different way. So, what's the bottom line? First, you have to decide what you're going to do about all this. Second, every time we have a meeting like this, if somebody disagrees with you, they just kind of keep their mouth shut, and everybody else thinks that, surely, to goodness, everybody in the world thinks this way because there's nobody screaming up here. And it's very deceptive when you spend all day, every day, just talking to people who agree with you, preaching to the choir. It's a very different world. So, I just want to make one last argument apropos of all this violence we're living through. One of our partners in the Clinton Global Initiative is a Kenyan bank, Equity Bank. And one of my models for the future is a Kenyan banker named James Mwangi, who made a partnership with the MasterCard Foundation, which is now based in Canada. It's called Wings to Fly, and they've trained together 10,000 young Kenyans who came from very disadvantaged backgrounds to succeed in finance and work. As they did the training program, the high school graduation rate of these kids in a poor area, they all came from terrible, difficult backgrounds, went to 96%. The percentage of them going to university is 90%. And they're doing great. And my daughter and I met with 5,000 of them when I was down there. And Lynn and her son Ben Stein were with us, so they were there watching this. And these people were telling stories, and I'm talking. One guy got up and said, you know, I spent a lot of my childhood in jail. And he said, I loved going to jail. It's the only time I had a roof over my head and I knew I'd get a good meal. And there was story after story like that. That's inclusive capitalism. That's more consumers, more business people, a better future. And that's the role of NGOs to try to help facilitate that. So, where are we? What we need is a business community that transfers back to a stakeholder society and a stakeholder economics, not just shareholder. We need more long-term perspective and less focusing on the next quarter. We need a financial system that enables people to trade if they insist on doing so. And I know Mark Carney's been dealing with this here with the Bank of England. But there are ways to make investment more attractive and trading relatively less, especially when it's higher risk. By some measures, Canada replaced the United States with the world's richest middle class last year. And if it happened, there's some dispute about it, but it's tight. If it happened, one of the reasons is they had no financial crash. And they always had unified banking. They had one institution could do investment banking or commercial banking, but they had smart regulations for both. And when the trading got a little too risky, there were higher capital requirements and greater restraints on that, even as commercial banking was allowed to proceed normally. So finance has to do that. Government has to provide a sensible regulation, the infrastructure, and a certain amount of research on the future, which we don't have enough time to talk about today. But it's very important that every society stay in the future business. That, too, is inclusive capitalism. The non-governmental movement, the philanthropists, the foundations, we're supposed to fill in the blanks between what the private sector can produce and government can provide And I think also we're supposed to try to figure out how to do things faster, cheaper, and better than they would otherwise be done. Finally, we all have obligations to these developing countries. We need to help them deal with corruption, capacity, human trafficking, drug trafficking, arms trafficking. And the two things, corruption and capacity, go hand in hand. The more capacity a country has, the less likely it is to be corrupt. But it's really important. I had the honor of representing the United States at the funeral of Lee Kuan Yew, the founder of Singapore. And I knew him and admired him, but he was absolutely convinced that his success was due, and Singapore's success was due to two things that he did. One is he enshrined inclusive politics. Every ethnic group, all religions, no discrimination against anybody. Everybody learned their native language in school and English because that was their commercial language. Number two, he ruthlessly got rid of corruption, even allowing his own supporters to go to prison if he caught them in it. Result? When Singapore became a nation in the early 60s, the per capita income was $900 a year. When we held his memorial service, it was $55,000 a year. Best argument I can think of for inclusive capitalism. So, I will end with a request that Indra Nooyi made of me. He said, we all ought to pick three things off an obvious list and just spend the next year trying to do them, trying to lengthen the time horizons, or create a stakeholder company, or change from trading to investment, or improve the government's role. Do not refuse to do something because you can't do everything. Do not make the perfect the enemy of the good. When I spoke here last year, a lot of people laughed at me because I said the best political book I had read in years was written by a Nobel Prize-winning microbiologist, E.O. Wilson, who in his 80s traced the history of all life on planet Earth insofar as the evidence would permit it. And he said, you have to conclude that the most successful species who ever lived are ants, termites, bees, and people. If success is defined by avoiding destruction when there were plenty of chances to get rid of you. And then he proceeds to regale you in tales of the marvelous cooperation of ants, termites, and bees, and says, really, people are the greatest cooperators because unlike them, we didn't just evolve, we actually have consciousness and a conscience, so it makes us vulnerable to arrogance and error, but boy, can we do things. So I want to leave you with this thought. When we were all in Africa, we went to an amazing elephant preserve in northern Kenya because my wife and daughter have tried to organize all 32 of the major organizations dedicated to saving them. And we went out to see the elephants. Along the way, I saw some anthills. 3 of them over 5 feet high. One of them was almost as tall as me, and it was built around a shade tree. And the ants stopped building when they got to the point where the leaves sprouted because they did not want to interfere with their shade. Cooperation works better than conflict. Inclusive capitalism works better than winner take all. Inclusive politics works better than what we got one more dose of today, where people think our differences matter a whole lot more than our common humanity. If the ants can do it, so can we. Somebody's got to be the grown-up in every room. Let's take a year and each try to do that every chance we get. Thank you very much.